Let me first lose a few words about my personal background in relations to the migration history in Vorarlberg. Probably I am a typical Vorarlberger. My family history has connections to Tyrol, Germany, and Hungary. My parents are born in Germany, but their mothers in Bregenz, and their forefathers were immigrants from Hungary and Germany. And this kind of family history is quite normal for many people in Vorarlberg. That means that it's also quite normal that different cultural influences come together in one family. I grew up in Bregenz, studied in Vienna and Berlin political science. I lived a few years in Freiburg im Breisgau and then came back to Austria. As a journalist and book author, I have dealt with the history of the region, especially with the history of migration. I wrote or edited a few books about the local history. Some of them you can see here. And I have, for example, directed several documentaries on Austrian TV about Turkish and ex-Yugoslavian immigrants, but also about modern expats in Vorarlberg or about older immigrants like the so-called Walser or the Jewish community of Hohenems, and about immigrants like the Schwabenkinder, which I will explain later. So that's enough about myself. Now let me tell you a bit about the cross-cultural aspects in the history of Vorarlberg. For a long time, Vorarlberg was a country of emigration. People had to emigrate seasonally or entirely to find work and support themselves. This had, first of all, economic reasons, because they could not find enough work within their own country. They worked, for example, as mercenaries for different warlords or armies, as Krautschneider, that means cabbage cutter, as you have seen it on the picture before, but also as builders of Baroque churches and cloisters, as craftsmen, or as agricultural assistants, like the so-called Schwabenkinder, children who were sent from spring till autumn to Swabia in the south of Germany, the so-called Schwabenland. And this phase of emigration lasted from the 16th to the beginning of the 20th century. So you might ask, why did they have to work abroad? The basic causes are the law of succession. Here it was Gebelkind, the equal division among all sons after the death of a person, so that the real estate always was shrinking and could only feed the people if they found a wealthy partner to marry with own real estate. The second reason was the general growth of the population because of the progress in sanitation and medicine. And that means that less children died in the first years of their life. So please let me have a sip. I'm not really healthy again. The largest emigration wave in the history of Vorarlberg happened after the year 1848, when thousands emigrated to the United States of America and other American countries. But then the causes were not only economic, but also political, after the suppression of the 1848 revolution. This emigration wave was also a counter movement to the labor immigration in the textile industry. Many of the immigrants were farmers, and they didn't want to give up their farm and work in a factory. But anyway, seasonal emigration is in particular brought many new influences into the country from outside. And there is much evidence that the so-called Fremdler were observed very skeptically by the guardians of tradition, especially if they worked in regions where liberal ideas were widespread. Besides these emigration movements, we find in the history of Vorarlberg a couple of historical immigration phases. Beginning with the immigration of Romans and the partially documented immigration of people called Alemanni between 1st and 7th century. Partially documented means that there are not much testimonials of this immigration. Archaeologists found a lot of traces and objects from the Roman period, but nearly nothing that proves the immigration of Alemanni. Very controversial is also the immigration of Walsers in the 13th and 14th century. This was originally a small group of people with special rights, but hundreds of years later, historians tried to define them as a group with the same provenance from the Swiss region Wallis. The evidence for this is also lacking. We find proven immigration of ruling houses from Tübingen and Aargau or Vienna in the shape of the Montfort counts or the Habsburg monarchy with all their administrators. And we found some Jewish families from the Lake Constance area. Oh, sorry. In the 14th century and after 1617, when the local counts of Hohenems recruited Jewish families to stimulate their economy. This Jewish community was wiped out under the Nazi regime. Vorarlberg finally became a land of immigration in the 19th century. However, because there, migration and industrialization, larger waves of immigration took place when industrialization expanded and the factory owners were looking for cheap labor. But also the factory owners by themselves and their skilled workers came partly from abroad, from Switzerland or Germany, also from Great Britain, where industrialization took place earlier. Despite the industrialization and the extensive immigration, the emigration to the United States and the seasonal migration, like the Schwabenkinder, continued until the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century. So, how did the population and the politics react to immigration? You can see here a flyer from 1861. You cannot read it, but I will show you a passage, a short quote out of this flyer. It says, strangers who profess a different faith from ours, strangers without love for our faith and customs, shall be allowed to settle with us, to share our old daily bought rights, our soil, our acquisition, and to order our affairs in our communities with us, perhaps soon without us. So who wrote this? It was Johann Anton Oelz, a member of the provincial parliament, and he wrote it in a leaflet from 1861. But who were these strangers? The strangers included Samuel Jenny, a factory owner and founder of the regional museum with origin from Switzerland, Ernst Freiherr von Pöllnitz, the owner of famous buildings in Bregenz, originally from Germany, John Jolter Douglas, factory owner and alpinist, the founder of the Alpine Club in Vorarlberg, who was born in Scotland, or Karl von Schwerzenbach, a factory owner and collector and archaeologist, and many more people. But why did Mr. Earls polemicize so much against them. They wanted to establish a Protestant community in Vorarlberg. And Earls wanted to hold the exclusive right of religious practice for the Catholic Church. So, if even the factory owners and representatives of bourgeois society were accused of being strangers, how did their workers fare? When we talk about bigger groups of immigrants in the course of industrialization, first of all, there were laborers from the Italian-speaking part of the monarchy, people from Trentino. They came mainly from the Val Sugana, where home-based work as silk spinners had failed because of diseases and cheap competition from China. Yes, there was already cheap competition from China in the 19th century. The men often were construction workers, partly specialized in railroad construction, and the women were textile workers. They came to Bludenz, to Boers, to Kennelbach and Hart, respectively, to build the Arlberg Railroad, the Flexenpass Road, and the Bregenzerwald Railroad. In the mentioned places, Italian-speaking population around 1900 was between 20 and 40% of the inhabitants, and they spoke another language as the locals. Sempre sciaffa, always work. A cross-culture word, construct of Italian and local dialect, used in satirical or better mockery songs about the immigrants. Over time, they were also sung by the immigrants by themselves. There were massive prejudice against the immigrants from Trentino, and the focus were linguistic and ethnic differences. They spoke another language, they wore different clothes, and they were said to behave differently. For example, a local author named Josef Wichner, he wrote 1893 in the reminiscences of his youth in Bludenz. At that time, the first foreign families came to the country, sons and daughters of a more southern sky, brown-skinned, black-haired, and brown-eyed people. They brought Welsh language and Welsh customs, Welsh uncleanliness and Welsh life. They clattered on their wooden sandals through the alleys of the factory towns and into the beautiful churches of the communities. The sentence about the churches is interesting because they were Catholics and used the same churches as the local people. But the textile workers from the Trentino had often own priests, for example, here in Bludenz, and also own girls' homes, because most of them were young women. The men from Trentino worked meanwhile on the construction site of the Arlberg Railroad and tunnel. So the immigrants from the Trentino left cultural traces, especially in dance music and lute ensembles. And they played also the Italian mockery songs, so-called Italiener Lieder, which I mentioned before. In the provincial parliament, there were political polemics against marriages with Trentines because they didn't speak German. And in a Dornbirn newspaper in the year 1880, it was written, "The Vorarlberg Germans have a good right to the protection not only of their nation, but also of healthy stomachs, which don't content with macaroni and polenta." That, of course, has changed in the last 140 years. In fact, the integration was strongly impaired by Italy's entry into the World War I and in the year 1915. But despite this conflict, the working people from Trentino partly remained after World War I. And so their names are still present today. Girardelli, Conci, Collini, Bertolini, Piatel, Spagolla, Tomaselli, and so on, especially in Hartbürs and Bludenz. But today, mostly, people don't even think about the provenance of these names. The next larger group of immigrants were people from Carinthia and Styria in Austria. Especially after World War I and after World War II, many of them came to Vorarlberg. Mostly, they came from structurally weak regions, and they began to work in the textile industry, which still grew, but also at construction trades, partly at other trades. They didn't speak another language as the local people. They had the same religion, but there were still prejudices, especially against unionized and politically organized workers. They were also so-called strangers, because now the demarcation line were linguistic differences. Local people discovered the dialect as a symbol of demarcation. The people from Carinthia and Styria were not only discriminated, but they were literally deported when they became unemployed in economic crisis, for example, in the 1930s. The justification for that was the right of residence, which declared that the municipality of origin, where they usually came from, must take care of the social welfare of unemployed people. The next larger group of immigrants were South Tyroleans during the World War II from 1939 to 1945. The basic cause for the immigration was the Hitler-Mussolini agreement and the so-called option or option from the year 1939. South Tyrol belonged to the Austrian monarchy until 1918, but then came to Italy. And now the people had the choice either to accept the Italian language as the only possible means of communication or the emigration to the German Nazi Reich. About 85% opted for emigration, and about 75,000, that's a third of the population, really emigrated, and 10,000 of them to Vorarlberg. The reason for the comparatively large number of South Tyrolean immigrants was the rapid construction activity of the company Vogevosi, which built large settlements throughout the country, like you have seen it before in the picture. In Bludenz, besides the Südtiroler Siedlung, was built by another company, and it was later finished in the year from 1947 to 1961. But anyway, the new neighbors were not welcomed with joy, although they were called German Volksgenossen. They were met with jealousy and resentment. So some of them returned to South Tyrol after the end of World War II, especially when the autonomy agreements were signed, which guaranteed again the German language in South Tyrol. But many of them stayed in Vorarlberg. They founded their own cultural associations like the dancing group Rosengarten, and the integration of the youth often succeeded through the church because they served as altar boys. And the second generation mostly integrated itself by speaking the same dialect as the local people. Today, there are still a few of the immigrants who speak the original South Tyrol dialect, but the younger ones don't do it at all. Some of their names are still present or even famous. For example, an architect called Untertrifaller, a surgeon named Schenk, or people with the names Untermazzona, Pfeiffer, Pedevilla, Paul Michel. At the same time as the people from South Tyrol, another group nearly of equal size came to Vorarlberg, but not at all voluntarily. They were forced laborers, Eastern workers, or prisoners of war. We are talking about approximately 10,000 people from Russia, Poland, France, and other countries. They were forced to work in the textile and armaments industry, in agriculture, or on high-altitude construction sites like the power plant construction in the Silvretta, or on road constructions, such as the Faschina Road in the Großen Walsertal. Most of them returned to their home countries at the end of the war. Some stayed here. Some even left their children here alone to spare them the conditions in their home country. Because forced laborers often were considered collaborators with the Nazis in their homeland, and sometimes exiled to labor camps when they came back. The last group of immigrants in connection with the Second World War were, of course, the refugees, especially after the end of the war. And it was an enormous number. The population of Vorarlberg grew from 160,000 around 1940 to nearly 240,000 shortly after the end of the war. It dropped again to 190,000 in about 1951 and reached 250,000 again by the mid-1960s. The war refugees before and after 1945 were bombed out people from different parts of Germany, Jewish displaced persons, people from Vienna and the Soviet zone who didn't want to live under the Soviets, even if they not have been Nazis. Then there were Germans from Sudetenland in Czechia, or refugees and displaced persons from areas previously occupied by Nazi Germany. Among the refugees from 1945 were also some artists from Vienna, and they helped to found, for example, the Bregenz Festival, as well as the regional theater in Bregenz. But even after 1945, some larger groups of refugees settled in Vorarlberg. 1956, refugees from Hungary. In the year 1958, Europe village was opened at Herbrands. It was built for refugees from Hungary, Yugoslavia, Belarus, and Russia, and some of their descendants are still living there. 1970s, in the 1970s, a group of boat people from Vietnam arrived. It was a smaller number of a few dozen. In the 1990s, war refugees, several thousand from Yugoslavia, from Croatia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina arrived, and also from Kosovo after 1998. And then, of course, people from Afghanistan and Chechnya after 2001, and from Syria from 2014. And today, we welcome new fellow citizens from Ukraine, of whom we do not know how long they will have to stay. Honestly, we welcome them. But don't ask me when the locals start to fear again that the newcomers will take away their jobs or anything else. Now we are slowly coming to the end, but I still owe you two major waves of immigration from the post-World War II period that are quite significant. First, there are the so-called guest workers, Gastarbeiter in German, who came here as a result of the recruitment agreement between Austria and Turkey. In fact, an agreement was first concluded with Spain in 1962, but the Spaniards preferred to come to Germany and Switzerland because salaries were higher there and still are in Switzerland. In 1964, therefore, followed the recruitment agreement with Turkey. This recruitment agreement was concluded because the economic growth in Austria and other countries in Northern Europe led to a shortage of labor. So the people should work in the textile industry, but also at road constructions and in other industries. And the Chamber of Commerce installed an own recruitment office in Istanbul. And then factory delegations traveled to Anatolia, checked the qualifications as tailors, etc. And they brought more and more workers to Vorarlberg. But the guest worker housing was less attractive. It was cramped and crowded and expensive. Sometimes 4 or 6 men were sleeping in the same room. They also had hardly any infrastructure. The meeting point for Turkish workers often was the train station. After years, opened the first prayer room for Muslim people at Dornbirn, in a private house which hosts the city museum today. Also in Dornbirn, opened the first Turkish grocery store in the 1970s. But the concept of the guest workers who go back like seasonal workers after a few years didn't succeed. Short-term stays proved counterproductive, especially for the factories who had to train the people. But the immigrants themselves also found that they did not get rich as quickly as they had hoped. Thus, temporary residence permits were introduced, but family reunifications were also made possible, that the wives or the children also came to Austria. After a few years, the recruitment was stopped because of the energy crisis of the 1970s, and return assistance programs were introduced. Population share of Turkish citizens nevertheless increased from 2% in 1971 to 6% in 1991. Decline due to naturalizations from 1995 to 2005, in these 10 years, nearly 13,000 Turkish immigrants became Austrians. The highest number of Turkish citizens in Vorarlberg was approximately 23,000 in 1973, by about 280,000 inhabitants totally in Vorarlberg at that time. Today, it are 400,000. The last major group of immigrants to be formally recruited were people from Yugoslavia. In 1966, the recruitment agreement was signed with the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. In the following years, people from today's Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina came to Vorarlberg. Originally, It was a relatively homogeneous group with many common leisure activities. They organized sports and cultural festivals, had an own soccer league with teams named by different regions of former Yugoslavia. It was the Jugoliga. But from the 1990s, as a result of the intra-Yugoslav war, internal conflicts arose also in this country. Finally, the national groups separated and formed their own national sports and cultural clubs. At least the war brought also new immigrants from war zones, first from Bosnia and Herzegovina, then from Kosovo in the 1990s. Of course, I should mention that today the largest group of foreigners are the Germans. Their number was increasing since Austria joined the European Union in 1995. So I come to the conclusion. Migration has been a substantial part of the history of our region for at least 400 years. And especially the economic rise and today's prosperity are unthinkable without immigrants. Despite this, emigrants and immigrants have always been confronted with prejudice and fears. Both the arrival of new groups and the mutual adoption of peculiarities of this region promoted the integration of the migrants. But there are undoubtedly still some intercultural problems to be solved. For example, when a group as large as Turkish immigrants have their own infrastructures that allow them to live without knowing the local language, integration takes longer. On the other hand, it is also delayed if people are constantly told that they are worth less than the natives. That's, on the other hand, we have to say many effects of migration help shape our everyday life. Not only pizza, kebabs, and spring rolls, but also cultural, sporting, and above all, economic characteristics imported from abroad.